So last Sunday, we were not in this facility. We were up the street at Noonan High School in the gym, which was great because we're a little limited. This facility seats 392 folks. And turns out we had just over 1,100 people that attended Easter gatherings last Sunday, which is great. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So for sure, though, 9 o'clock it didn't have a ton of space. 11 o'clock is looking like there's not a ton of space. And so I guess we're going to just sell this and we're going to move back to the high school and we're going to be in the gym every week. You laugh. We're probably doing that next week. I mean, is it really happening? I'm just kidding. Kind of. So, but either way, last week we were doing Easter gatherings, right? We were doing Easter gatherings and we wrapped up our Easter talk with a phrase where we said, hey, we want to remember Jesus. And I gave you a list of things that says, hey, no matter what's going to happen, if there's two words you could walk away with this morning, it would be those two words, remember Jesus. Situation, remember Jesus. Situation, remember Jesus. Situation, remember Jesus. However, we also acknowledge the fact, though, that it's easy to say remember Jesus if you're a Jesus follower. Or at least it's easier to say remember Jesus if you're a Jesus follower. It's a lot more difficult to say remember Jesus if you're not a Jesus follower. If you don't even think Jesus is a legitimate person that was actually here and lived and walked around among us, if that's not even something on your plate, well, then it's a little more difficult to say such a thing, right? So what I asked last week was everyone should assign themselves a number based upon where they are at with the resurrection. And so we said, hey, if you're a 1, then you're going to fall into the little place in the category that says, hey, in terms of the resurrection, I believe it's very much like a Disney story, like a fairy tale. And it's a great fairy tale, and it's moving, and it's emotional. I mean, it's Cinderella almost. It's kind of Superman-ish, right? But that's what I believe. It's just a comic book. It's a fairy tale, and that's what I am. I'm a 1. Or we said you could be a 5, and a 5 is someone who says, I believe that there was a historical man named Jesus who died on a cross at the hands of the Romans and at the hands of the religious leaders in the Jewish community, that he actually died a physical death, so his brain activity stopped, his heart stopped beating, there was no more oxygen in his system, and he actually died. His body began to decompose. He was put into a grave, into a tomb. The tomb was sealed, and on Sunday, 3 days later, that same body that was decomposing resurrected and walked out of that tomb. And that people who were connected to him, about 500 folks, saw him on the post side of his death on the cross, right? So post-resurrection, that people saw him, interacted with him. And because of those things, he is the Son of God, right? So that's what a 5 looks like. 2, 3, and 4 is just any step in between. And so I said, hey, before we get into anything else, you need to ask yourself, where am I at on that spectrum? Am I 1? Am I 2? Am I 3? Am I 4? Am I 5? And then I followed that up with, I want to just ask, what are the obstacles in your life? What are the questions that you need answered to help you take a step, if you're a 1, 2, 3, or 4, another number closer to 5? What would the questions be? And so we put a QR code up on the screen last week and said, hey, if you will just take your camera and put it in the same direction as this QR code, click the link, it will take you to a Google form where you could anonymously submit any question you wanted to, right? And about 10% of the people that attended Easter gatherings, right? So we had about 1,140 or so that attended Easter gatherings. We had over 100 questions that came in anonymously through our form last week. And I said, we're clearing our teaching calendar because I don't think it's acceptable for you to be sitting here with questions that no one will answer for you. And I didn't know what the questions were going to be. And so Sunday night, I started looking at them, and I didn't realize we would have that many questions, right? That's a lot of questions. That's a lot of questions. Thankfully, those questions, a lot of them are very similar to one another, and they fit decently into some pretty large categories. And so today, we take on the very first of those questions, and for the next 7 weeks, starting today, we're going to take those questions and put them in categories, and I'm going to do my very best to bring the answers to you. Today's first question It wasn't the first question that was submitted. However, it does represent just over 10% of the entirety of the questions that were asked. And because it's the question that it is, it makes no sense for me to give you answers in weeks 2 through 6 unless question 1 is answered. And that is this: how do I know I can trust the Bible? Is the Bible reliable? Is the Bible trustworthy? So, over the next 6 hours, that's what we're going to dive into. Y'all are laughing not at my jokes, but at my serious things. And my jokes, you just let go. The first question we have to ask is it reliable? In other words, is what we read today what was originally written 2,000 years ago? You've all played the game Telephone, right? Like, y'all play that game, and y'all know how it works. The first person says something, and by the time it gets to the other end, it's something completely different. Like, when it starts over here, it's like, I'd like to have a sausage biscuit. And then by the time it passes one person to the next person, to the next person, to the next person, it's, hey, babe, let's smoke a brisket. You know what I'm saying? It's like, that's what happens. And it gets all the way over here, and it has nothing to do with that. And so the question becomes, over 2,000 years, is it possible that what was originally written is different from what we read in our Bibles today? That's a really valid question, because everything that we have in our lives, when we hand down information, a lot of times ends up with biscuit to brisket, right? And they're two completely different things. So it's a valid question, and that question deserves an answer. Let's go through a few things, and hopefully I'm going to do my very best to bring a little bit of life to the question. However, I will warn you, this has the tendency to become a bit academic, but I'm going to do my very best to keep it moving in a positive direction. First thing is this: we actually get the name Bible around the 4th century. Prior to the 4th century, and so for those of you who are not like historians, when we say 4th, it's really something that starts with a 3, which makes no sense to me. That's just the way it is. So in the 300s, right, AD, right, the 4th century, we get this term that we know it today as the Bible. Before then, they didn't call it the Bible. They called it the Scriptures or Holy Scriptures, or they would refer to it just by individual books. When we look at the Bible, there's a few very just common statistics. It was written over the period of 1,500 years. There's about 40 different authors that contributed to the book, and they wrote in 3 different languages. The Bible's broken up into 2 parts, an Old Testament and a New Testament. In the Old Testament, there's 39 pieces or parts, or 39 books. In the New Testament, there's 27 books. And so, since they were all individual pieces and parts that are now we know as one book, or at least 2 parts of one book, the question becomes, how did we know which parts we wanted to put in there? And how do we know that the parts we wanted to put in there is what people that were associated with Jesus actually wrote? This term for this is called canonization. Canon is a term that means a straight rod or ruler, which is used for a test of straightness or measurement of some kind of length. And when we look at canonization, we look at how did we decide which books or which letters would be taken and put together to create what we know as the Bible. There's some criteria that they had to meet. Now, this talk about the Bible as a whole, honestly, is a really long talk. And I spent better part of 4.5 hours yesterday whittling it down to what I'm going to talk about today. It was much lengthier, and honestly, we could probably do all 7 weeks and still have some left over. And so I'm not going to get into everything, and I had to make a decision last night, which usually my message is not where I'm deciding the night before, but because I didn't get started till Monday, it's just so much information. The only time I'm going to really have today is to address the New Testament. There's a completely different set of circumstances and conversations about the Old Testament that I won't have time to get to today. So I'm just going to focus on the second part and the New Testament because they're completely different conversations, right? So when we look at canonization, specifically when we talk about the New Testament, the very first thing in order to be included is that the book or the letter that was written that's put into the Bible needed some kind of apostolic connection, directly from or close associate with. In other words, when we use apostolic connection, it just means that there are a group of people that we refer to as apostles, that the Bible refers to as apostles. And those particular folks, we want to know, did they write it? Because they claim to have spent time with Jesus. And people say they spent a lot of time with Jesus. So if they wrote something about Jesus, we feel good that, hey, that's accurate because they were there. We don't want to take books that were written by friends of friends of friends about what they heard them say over the campfire one night late at night while they were just hanging out, and they wrote it down and said, let's throw that in the Bible. We want people who are close to the action. And if they weren't actually in the action, we want someone that's a close associate, a scribe or some kind of religious scholar or someone who has a little bit of an education, maybe a historian themselves that had a connection to an apostle. And so that's what we're looking for. That's number one. The second one is orthodoxy or right belief. In other words, it's not contradicting what we already know to be true. Now, fortunately, 51% of the New Testament lies in the writings of just two people. A church planter by the name of Paul, who goes and plants churches all over, and he writes letters to these churches, and we take that and we know that what he is doing by far lines up with the heart of Jesus. Now, Paul in and of himself is an incredible story. In fact, just his life is a really great example of why we should be able to trust the story of Jesus. He was an enormous, how do I say this nicely? He hated the church. In fact, he wanted to destroy the church. He wanted to destroy all Christians for an enormous part of his life. And then he had an encounter with Jesus that changed his mind. And this encounter with Jesus happened after the crucifixion. And so that's what it took to change Paul's mind. And when he, instead of being someone who locks Christians up and actually oversees their execution through persecuting Christians, he becomes one of the greatest evangelists, one of the greatest mouths and mouthpieces for the church that the world has ever seen. And so Paul writes an enormous piece. And there was another guy, his name was Luke. He's an historian. And goodness, when you look into the historical reliability of just Luke, he has done wonders for the historical community in terms of the history of the first century Rome. I mean, it's unbelievable what his biblical record has proven and shown to be true for people who study the first century of Roman culture. It's unreal. And so those two, they've written 51% of what we see in terms of words of the New Testament. And so when we start looking at other books or letters to put in, we get to compare it against those really early writings, that 51%, and see, do they contradict one another? And when there's no contradiction, we feel good that, hey, we can put that together. So that's the second piece. The third big criteria is this, that there was church-wide acceptance. In other words, before we started putting a label on it, this is the Bible, was the church itself actually using the writings that were circulated as authoritative? Did they say, hey, we actually believe what was written here? Because here's the deal. If you went to church with one of Jesus' closest friends, let's say Peter, and you went to the church that he was working at, well, anything he wrote would be like, oh, this is good. This is great, right? And so you would begin using it in your church. Like, hey, this is what Jesus taught. Peter was standing there, you know? And so the church would start to use it. Well, now, if the church didn't have any idea where this writing came from, it didn't matter how articulate it was, didn't matter how pretty it was or how good the handwriting was or any of those things. If the church had never heard of this, which you can go on National Geographic or you can YouTube the Lost Gospels, that's what all of those are. The Gospel of Thomas, when you start looking into those kind of things, the church had no clue about them. The church never used them. The church had never heard of it. And all of a sudden, hundreds of years later, it pops up like it's something special. And the church is like, no, we're not going to add something that, and honestly, it contradicts a lot of what's in the rest of the Bible. So those were the three criteria. But honestly, when we look at the Bible itself, and we ask the question, it's circular logic or circular reasoning. It's a circular argument to use the Bible to prove itself as true. And so I don't want to talk about the Bible anymore. And honestly, let's just put it behind us and let's just let it go. Because at the end of the day, that is enough for me. But honestly, when I really begin to look into it, there is something inside of me that says, you know what, I'm a logical person and I don't want to use the Bible to prove the Bible. So let's look at other historical documents that we have that we fully trust in terms of history. These would be documents that if you took a world geography or world history class in your junior or senior year of high school, or you majored in world history, these are documents that you would use as parts of textbooks, and for sure would be documents that you studied. The first one, let's talk about this. Caesar's Gallic Wars. The Gallic Wars were waged between 58 and 50 BC by the Roman general Julius Caesar against the people of Gaul, which is present-day France, Belgium, Germany, and Switzerland. And it talks about the expansion of the Roman Empire. It's an enormously popular piece of history. And when we look at it, it was written between 144 BC. The earliest evidence we have that this actual document exists is actually in AD 900, 950 years after it was originally written. In other words, we don't have the original copy of Caesar's Gallic Wars. We have a copy that shows up 950 years after it actually was written. And we have 10 copies of this. Now, this is something that we talk about because it's Roman history. And when we look at the expansion of the Roman Empire, this is all over the place. Let's look at a second one. The writings of Plato. Maybe you've heard of him. One of his most famous writings is The Republic. It's for sure his best known work. It's one of the world's most influential works in terms of philosophy and political theory, intellectually and historically. It was written in 427 to 347 BC. The earliest evidence that we have that this exists is 900 AD, 1,250 years after it was originally written. And we've got 7 copies. Let's look at a Roman historian named Tacitus, one of the greatest Roman historians. He's regarded as one of the greatest Roman historians by modern scholars. The surviving portions of his 2 major works, the Annals and the Histories, examine the reigns of Emperor Tiberius, Claudius, Nero. And these works in particular cover from 14 AD to 96 AD. And when we look at Roman history, him alone gives us so much insight into the Roman Empire. It was written around 100 AD. The earliest evidence we have that was actually written is in 1100 AD, 1,000 years after it was first written. And we've got 20 copies of it. The writings of Thucydides, he writes the history of the Peloponnesian War. This recounts the 5th century war BC between Sparta and Athens, one that they make movies about. 460 to 400 BC. The earliest evidence we have, 900 AD, 1,400 years later. And we've got 8 copies. Honestly, I'm getting bored with myself, and so I'm going to hurry this up a little bit. I'm almost done, but I'm going to speed through this last little part. The plays of Sophocles, one of the most celebrated Greek playwrights in history. He won 24 of 30 playwriting competitions over 40 years. His plays were written between 496 BC and 406 BC. The earliest copy we have is from AD 1000. 1,400 years later, and we've got 100 copies. The writings of Aristotle. Aristotle covers things like physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, poetry, drama, music, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, politics, meteorology, geology, and government. And we use all of his writings still. 384 BC to 322 BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 1100, 1,400 years after it was originally written, and we've got 5 copies. Now let's talk about the New Testament. Written between AD 40 and 100. The earliest pieces of that particular New Testament, I'm going to call it just a book, even though it's a series of letters and books. The earliest pieces we have come from AD 130, between 30 and 90 years after it originally was written. We have our very first full manuscript in AD 350, 250 years after it was originally written. And of that, we've got 5,000 Greek, 10,000 Latin, and 9,000 in other languages. I don't know. It's gone. Has that been gone the whole time? Okay. Is it coming back? Should I move on, or is it coming back? Okay, we're trying. Cool. So, did you see the whole chart? Oh, just 2 or 3 of them. Great. Y'all scare me. Hey. Woo. There it is. All right. Now the babies are crying. I'm sorry. My bad. So when you look at this, everything that's above it, right? These are what we call in our modern society historical documents. Yet when we get to the bottom line, because it asks you to believe in some ways of living that might not be so open to interpretation, all of a sudden there's a lot more scrutiny put on it. But when we take a look at what we decide or what we have the ability to logically come to a conclusion with in terms of historical evidence, the Bible just drowns everyone else. But that only answers the question, is it reliable, right? So when we read Plato or Aristotle, when we read those guys, because of the evidence we have, we come to the conclusion, you know what? I believe Plato actually wrote this. I believe Aristotle actually wrote this. I believe the history of the Peloponnesian War, I believe this is how the battle happened, right? We just naturally get there. And so all this proves is that what was written in the first century by the followers of Jesus, by the apostles, that's what we read today, right? So that's all it does. It doesn't say that it's true. It doesn't prove that it's 100% accurate. What is accurate is that what was written is what we now read. We want a sausage biscuit. The message on the other end is we want a sausage biscuit, right? That's the only thing this proves, is that this is what they wrote. Now, what it doesn't prove is what they wrote actually trustworthy. In other words, are the people and the places that are inside of what they wrote, are they real? Because the truth is, just like the playwright, those were fiction. Those weren't true. Those were tragedies, actually, in the genre of tragedies. And so we don't think that those tragedies were true just because they're old and because they're accurate. So maybe there's still a case, while at the same time, or at the end of the day, we do believe that this is what was written in the first century, that what we read today is on the plus side of 99% accurate, right? There's a less than 1% of discrepancies between the manuscripts that we have. None of them impact the meaning of anything significant. There are a lot of times there are numbers that are flipped or backwards or a misspelling of a word, right? So it's not flawless in terms of all the manuscripts that we have. But we're 99 on the plus side of that percent sure that this is what they read in the first century. The second question that's probably even more important, if we can get an answer to the first question, which I believe we can, according to the way we judge every other historical document, is this: is the Bible trustworthy? In other words, it's not enough to know if what we're reading is actually what was written. We want to know if it's accurate. And one of the ways that we can kind of help do this is through a completely different study, archaeology. Until about 200 years ago, though, archaeology was one of the greatest cases against the Bible. There are so many cities, political figures, and events that no one had ever heard of. And so when people started digging into it, it was like, hey, there is no archaeological evidence that some of these cities you're talking about have ever existed. That some of these Roman officials that you claim interacted ever existed or ever held office. In the mid-1800s, biblical archaeology actually started to become a legitimate thing. But it really hasn't picked up until the late 1950s, or early 1950s, when the actual legitimate establishment of the independent state of Israel in the Middle East. And once that happened, we started doing more archaeological digging. To give you a reference, though, we have, in terms of the archaeology work that's happened already, it is minuscule. Minuscule. There are so many issues with where you can dig in the Middle East and what land belongs to who, and you're not touching this, and this is my piece of dirt, and so don't you sniff it. You go sniff your own dirt, all those things. It's really extremely difficult. And when we do find a historical site that we want to dig into and find something, they just give them a teeny tiny little square, and you better hope something's in your square, right? It's not like what we would do here if we go out west and we want to find some dinosaur bones, right, out towards Utah. Well, the whole area, shut the whole thing down, we'll make it a national park, right? That's not what's happening in the Middle East. This is helpful. Once we've started digging in those sites throughout the Middle East, what we've been able to find is 100% pure gold. And not gold as in shiny gold, but like legitimate gold. In fact, one of the top 3 archaeologists of the 20th century says it this way: it may be clearly stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever contradicted a single biblical reference. That as soon as they started digging in the dirt, the only thing it's done is further proven that the Bible is accurate and trustworthy. But honestly, is it enough for us to believe that the Roman Empire existed? Is it enough for us to believe that there was a guy named Pilate who actually worked in the Roman government around the time that Jesus, existed and walked the earth? Is that really what's going to do something for our faith? No, if there's anyone that I want to know if they really existed, it isn't Pilate. It isn't any of his followers. It's Jesus. And so I want to ask the question, if we leave the Bible out of it, is there a case that there was actually a man named Jesus? And one of the first people that I want to share with you is a Jewish historian named Josephus. He was a Jewish historian in the 1st century. And I'm going to give you a few of these. And I just want to make sure that you know that these are people that have no affiliation to Christianity. They are not Christians. They had no reason to say anything good or positive about Christianity. And Josephus is one of those people. And from his writings, we affirm these 2 things: the existence of Jesus as a person, like he was a man, and also he affirms that James was the brother of Jesus. So those are the 2 most significant things that Josephus writes about, right? Now, it's one thing, though, for us to talk about a Jewish historian, because the truth is that Judaism gave birth to Christianity. And so let's just even leave the Jewish historians out of it. Let's talk to people who had zero connection to any type of religion at all remotely related to Christianity. Let's talk about the Romans, some of the greatest historians in the history of the world. The first one is Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman governor. And he said this. He writes in his own writings, he says that there are Christians who wouldn't worship the emperor's image. And so he's not saying anything about the Christians. He's just saying, hey, here's the deal. There are Christians where I'm the governor, and they refuse to worship the image of the emperor. The second thing he says about these Christians is that Christians met together and sang hymns to Christ as if to a god. So he's not saying that Christ was a god. He's just saying there was a guy named, for sure, that there was Christians who would not worship the emperor's image, and that these same Christians met together to worship some god named Christ as if he was a god. The second one, Suetonius, also a Roman historian. He wrote about Emperor Claudius in AD 49, where he expelled the Jews due to a riot in Rome caused, in his writing, at the instigation of Christus, a reference to Jesus Christ. Tacitus, the greatest Roman historian, said this: the name Christian comes from Christ, a person who had been executed as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. He also said the time frame for Jesus' death, AD 26 to AD 36. He also writes this, that followers of Jesus increased in number after his execution, all the way from Jerusalem to Rome. The last one I'll share with you is a guy named Thallus, another Roman historian. He writes about the darkness in the middle of the day on the day of the crucifixion. Now, none of these guys say that Jesus is the Son of God. None of them say that he died on the cross for our sins. But they all talk about Jesus. And they all talk about the followers of this Jesus. In all, because honestly, I could go on forever and ever, let me give you a very brief summary of 11 facts that we find about Jesus that are written by people who have nothing to do with the Bible and nothing to do with Christianity, all historical scholars. What we know about a real person named Jesus from the non-Christian, non-biblical sources, 1 through 11. Number 1 is he's Jewish. Number 2, that he lived in the first third of the first century. Number 3, people believed he was born out of wedlock. Number 4, he did wondrous feats. Number 5, he gathered disciples. 6, he lived in conflict with Jewish authorities. 7, he was a sorcerer that led Israel astray. 8, some believed he was the Messiah. 9, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, AD 26 to 36. He was believed to be seen raised from the dead by followers who now worship him as a god. Number 11, his brother James was martyred in AD 62 by the high priest. That's a list of all the facts that we find from people who have nothing to do with Christianity, who never decided to become Christians. And in their writings, none of them even sat out to write about this. They were writing about something else, but this was just an aside in their writing. Like, oh, and by the way, this is what's happening, right? They're telling the story of what's happening in the last year, and this is a little footnote of what's happening, right? That's what we find. Overall, let me give you this summary. This is what we have proof of. We have proof that what the first century church wrote, read, and followed is what we have in our Bible today. We have proof that each archaeological dig further confirms the existence of biblical places and people. We have proof that Jesus was a real person. We have proof that the number of Jesus' followers grew drastically in number after the crucifixion, and they all say it's because of his resurrection. And there is no proof that Jesus didn't resurrect from the dead. And for 2,000 years, people have been attempting to prove it. But they've gotten nowhere. Now, the truth is, though, I would like for you to do the same thing. In fact, if one of you could figure out a way to bankroll a little excavation that would prove that Jesus never resurrected from the dead, that he wasn't the Son of God, I would very much so invite that, because I have other things I could do with my time. It changes everything for me. If this Jesus thing isn't real, and I'm really legitimately YOLO, that's it. I get one of these things. I turn 40 this year. I've got things I need to do. You know what I'm saying? I got things. Now, if Jesus did resurrect from the dead, though, those things on that list begin to kind of pale in comparison to what I feel like I'm called to for the rest of my life. And so I'm good. I am good with skepticism. I'm good with cynicism. I'm good with searching and researching and trying to discover. I'm good with the questions. I'm good with follow-up questions. I'm good with research. I'm good with asking tough questions. I'm good with not just taking it at face value. I'm good with let's investigate it. I'm good with let's go to Israel and just see for ourselves. I'm good with that. And at the end of the day, the truth is, you're worth the answer. You're worth the answer. You, just you. Yeah, all of us collectively, but if it was just you, you are still worth the answer. You see, we know the Bible is reliable and trustworthy in terms of it being a historical document. We know that what we read in the Bible today is what was written, and we know the people and places in the New Testament are real people and places. But there's so much more. There's so much more. And in fact, as I started prepping for this on Sunday night and started reading through the questions, and then we came to a conclusion late Monday of here are the categories and here's how we're going to break them down. And my prep for this message started on Tuesday. And I reached out to a friend and said, hey, I'm looking for a digestible resource on this particular topic. And there's not one that's coming to mind. All my books are just too academic, and they're difficult for just anyone who just wants to read something to swallow. And so he got back to me on Wednesday. And so I downloaded it and I started listening to it on Amazon Audible. And I got through 3 or 4 chapters, and I went ahead and purchased a bunch of these to have here today. And so my policy, though, is that I don't recommend a book unless I've read it. And so I spent the rest of my time finishing this and writing our message for today. And here's the thing. There's so much in here, and there's so much more. You could do 10 or 15 of books this size if you really want to get into even more details. But this is a legitimate start. It covers every single thing I've said today, plus a ton more. And I wanted to make sure that it was available to you. So we've done this 2 ways. You can purchase the book today, and just full disclosure, this cost us like $17 and some change, something like that. And we've got them out at the Blue Tent today. We've got, a bunch of copies. And we're just going to sell them for $20 even, because it's easier for us to deal in round numbers, right? So if you want to save the $2 and wait for it, we also have a QR code at the Blue Tent where you can just take your phone over there and scan it, and it will take you right to the Amazon page, and you can Amazon Prime yourself your own copy to your own house, right? So either way works. For sure, if you're thinking, I'm going to save one for someone else, we do not need a bunch of copies of this book sitting around, right? I'll give them to our staff if there's some left over, but for sure, let's make sure we run out of these first, and then you can Amazon your copies some if you can, because we just don't want to do a library here, so that's not a thing. So if you want to do that, we're going to make it available out there for you, and I promise you, like, this is doable for pretty much everyone in here, right? I mean, it is really doable. For you to take this and digest it and have a really good understanding and grasp on what we've talked about this morning. Now, here's the thing. The book can prove that it's reliable in terms of it's what was written in the first century. The book can prove that, that it's actually trustworthy in terms of these are real people and real places. Here's what the book can't do for you, though. It can't prove to you that Jesus was divine. Like, it can talk about Jesus being divine, but it can't actually prove that. It can actually say, hey, this is what happens, and these things seem divine, right? Resurrection from the dead, those kind of things. But again, it's just the Bible proving the Bible, right? And so when I told you at the end of our Easter gathering that to me it's unacceptable for people who are searching for a relationship to Jesus, for their family members, or for anyone for that matter, or for a pastor or anyone, to look at you when you ask a tough question and just say, please just shut up and believe, right? Like that's inexcusable. And that's why we decided to clear our teaching calendar, not knowing what the questions would be, because we didn't want to be a church that just said, just believe. Will you just stop causing us issues and just believe? But the truth is that the work that we've done this week and the work that you can do on your own with this book, or many others, I can recommend more if you want to get past this and go on to something else, that work is only going to get you 90% of the way there. It's only going to get you 90% of the way there. The truth is that faith is actually what the book that we're trying to prove is legit. It does say this is required. And so I could get you a long ways and super close to understanding who God and Jesus is. But there is a 10% faith bridge, and the only way across it's faith. No word or writing can prove that Jesus is the Son of God. And for that, I say, do the work. Don't make a decision about the last 10% if you're skeptical until you've done the work on the first 90. Because I think most of us won't do the last 10% work because we've already assumed the first 90. So let's do the work of the first 90% and then make a decision. Can I make the last 10% with faith? That's what I would ask. Don't take my word for it. You do the work. And if you need more resources, I'll give you resources. If you want to have a conversation, you want to get together and have coffee. I don't drink coffee, but I'll watch you drink coffee. It'll be awkward. You'll love it. I'll drink something, but I won't drink coffee. If you want to get together and just talk a little bit more, I'm down with that. If some of our staff seem like nicer people than I am, they are. They'll love to get together with you and have the conversation. It's open. We believe in the skeptic and the cynic because Jesus believes in you. Jesus believes in you so much. He said, man, I'm willing to give my life for you, even while you are in your state of unbelief. As you think through your own life and your own decision, I think that's probably the best way to look at it. Don't expect someone to spoon feed you a decision of faith that impacts that much of your life. Let each of us do the work to make a well-informed decision about our own faith. And if there's anything we can do as a church, we would love to give it an opportunity to say yes. As you take your journey and you own your faith.